The Australian outback was alive with the pulse of summer, red dirt shimmering under a blazing sun, eucalyptus trees creaking in the breeze, and the chirps and rustles of countless creatures echoing through the stillness. But above it all loomed an uneasy silence, a pause in the usual rhythm of life. Something was changing. The skies had darkened for days, rolling clouds hanging thick and low over the horizon. Rain had come, first a drizzle, then sheets of water pouring from the heavens. The creeks swelled, rivers broke their banks, and the flat land could no longer drink fast enough. The floods began creeping forward like silent ghosts, swallowing everything in their path. Far out near the Macquarie Marshes, nestled in the heart of New South Wales, lived a solitary kangaroo named Giru. He was a strong eastern grey, his powerful tail and thick legs honed from years of bounding across open terrain. Giru had lived a quiet life, roaming from one pocket of scrubland to the next, content in his own company, but always alert, always watchful. Giru had felt the warning signs in his bones long before the humans in the nearby towns did. The parched earth's sudden greed for water, the way birds stopped singing, the buzz of insects gone quiet, it all whispered the same truth: trouble was coming. As the downpour roared for its third day, Giru took shelter beneath the dense canopy of a river gum. The ground around him had already become a mire of mud and puddles, and his instincts urged him to move. But something held him there. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps something more. He kept scanning the treetops. That's when he heard it, the faintest, most pitiful chirp. It came from above, where the wind whipped through a tree half submerged in the swelling floodwaters. Giru tilted his head. There, clutching to the edge of a battered nest, was a tiny bird. Its feathers were drenched, its wings trembling, and its eyes wide with fear. A yellow-throated scrub wren, no bigger than a fist. The nest had already begun to unravel. Loose twigs floated away like forgotten memories, and the branch to which it clung swayed dangerously under the storm's wrath. Another chirp, a plea. The bird's mate or mother was nowhere in sight. Giru's eyes locked on the tiny creature. He had no reason to care. In the laws of nature, such things were common. Life and death shared the same river. But something stirred in him, something ancient and deep. Compassion, perhaps, or the simple urge to do what no one else could. The floodwaters lapped at his feet now, rising steadily. Giru knew he couldn't climb the tree. Kangaroos weren't built for that. But the branch was bending lower, and the water was rising fast. With a bounding leap, Giru launched himself through the shallow water, closing the distance between him and the tree. The wind howled around him, and sheets of rain blurred his vision. His paws sank into the mud, but he pushed forward until he reached the base of the tree. The little bird chirped again, flapping helplessly. The branch dipped lower. Then, a crack. A sharp, violent snap echoed through the air as the branch gave way and the sodden nest began to fall. Without hesitation, Giru stood on his haunches and raised his forearms. The nest, or what was left of it, landed in the crook of his arm, but the bird tumbled free, sliding into the flood. Giru reacted on instinct. With his sharp reflexes, he cupped his paws and scooped the little creature before it was swept away. It thrashed weakly, spitting water, but it was alive. He didn't know what to do next, only that he couldn't stay here. The waters were rising, and the ground beneath him was starting to vanish. He glanced toward the distant hills, higher ground. Cradling the trembling bird against his chest, Giru turned and began hopping through the flood, his powerful legs pushing through waterlogged earth and submerged bushes. The current was stronger now, tugging at his legs, forcing him to navigate carefully. He moved from one patch of solid ground to the next, often barely visible under the water's surface. Behind him, the flood consumed the river gum. Its roots gave way, and it collapsed into the water with a crash. The bird huddled closer into Giru's fur, its body shivering with exhaustion and fear. Giru kept going, one leap at a time, eyes locked on the distant ridge that still stood above the floodline. Thunder cracked above, and the world seemed to shudder. For an hour, he pushed forward, each leap a small miracle. He paused only when he reached a rock outcropping barely rising above the flood. He sheltered there for a moment beneath an overhanging bush, panting. The bird chirped faintly, now nestled in the curve of his warm fur. As the storm raged on, Giru waited for a break in the weather. He looked down at the bird and blinked slowly. In return, the tiny creature stared back, wary, but calmer now. It let out a small, warbling whistle. Not fear, this time. Gratitude, maybe. Jiro twitched an ear, unsure what he was doing or why he cared. But he knew one thing: the bird wasn't safe yet. Higher ground was still a distance away, and the water wouldn't stop rising anytime soon. The journey wasn't over. Far off in the distance, a faint noise rose on the wind: shouts, engines, the rumble of something human. Rescue teams. But they were still miles away. And between Jiro and help lay the most dangerous part of the flood zone. As night began to fall and the rain slowed to a drizzle, Jiro gathered his strength again. The bird was no longer just a stranger. It was his responsibility now. And he would not let the flood win. Night in the flooded bush was a different kind of darkness, thick, humming, alive. It swallowed the landscape in a wet hush, broken only by the distant rumble of water and the croaking of frogs that had climbed to higher branches to escape the rising tide. The rain had slowed, but the floodwaters were still moving, creeping into the lower valleys like slow, liquid beasts. Jiro huddled beneath a makeshift shelter of broken branches and leaves atop the rocky outcropping. The little bird, now simply called Chirp in Jiro's mind, remained nestled against his warm chest, its tiny breaths fluttering against his fur. Chirp had survived the worst of the storm, but the real danger wasn't over. The land between them and the high ridge was now a vast, sunken plain. The flood had turned the terrain into a jagged lake, full of invisible perils: submerged fences, deep ditches, twisted roots. To reach safety, Jiro would need to cross a wide channel where a swollen creek had broken its banks and merged with the surrounding flood. The current there was fast, pulling whole tree limbs into its grasp. Jiro knew it would be the most dangerous part of their journey. But he didn't hesitate. At first light, a faint golden hue painted the edge of the horizon. The storm clouds had finally begun to break apart, offering a glimpse of the sun. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close. Jiro stirred. His muscles ached from the night's cold, but his resolve hadn't wavered. He gently nudged Chirp awake with his nose. The little bird blinked blearily, then chirped a soft, raspy note. It wasn't quite cheerful, but it was alive. Jiro adjusted his stance, cupping his forearms around Chirp to keep him steady, and turned toward the waterlogged plain stretching before them. With a quiet grunt, he leapt down into the shallows and began the next leg of their journey. At first, the ground was manageable. The water rose to his ankles, then to his knees, but there were islands of firm ground between the murky patches. He hopped from mound to mound, always testing the footing before launching again. Chirp clung tightly to the fold of fur near his chest, too weak to fly, but alert now, watching Jiro's movements. The deeper channel came into view like a wound in the earth. Its current sliced through the trees with terrifying force. Jiro paused behind a half-submerged log, assessing. There was no easy path forward. Debris floated past: branches, pieces of fencing, a child's toy. The flood had stolen everything from somewhere. He would have to swim. Kangaroos could swim, but not well. Their long limbs were better suited for land, their tails awkward in deep water. But Jiro had no choice. He looked down at Chirp and gave a soft grunt, as if to say, "Hold on." With a powerful kick, Jiro launched into the water. The current hit him like a punch. It dragged at his legs, twisted his body sideways. He kicked and paddled, his head bobbing above the surface. Chirp chirped sharply, clutching tighter to his fur as water sprayed into the air around them. Jiro fought with everything he had. Every stroke was a battle. The water tried to turn him, push him under. His back legs strained to stay afloat. Twice he dipped beneath the surface, only to come up sputtering, his grip on Chirp never faltering. A fallen tree trunk jutted out of the water ahead. Jiro angled toward it, his energy flagging. With one final surge, he reached it, slamming his chest against the rough bark. He gripped it with his front paws and hauled himself halfway out of the water, panting. Chirp chirped once, a weak, grateful sound. The far side of the channel was just 50 meters away now. Beyond that, higher ground. A small rise where grass still showed. If they could reach it, they'd have a chance. Jiro rested only a moment before pushing off the log and swimming the final stretch. The current was calmer here, but his limbs were exhausted. His breath came in wheezes. But finally, his paws touched earth. He pulled himself out of the water and collapsed onto the muddy bank. Chirp tumbled gently onto the grass beside him but quickly hopped back to his side. The bird's feathers were drenched, but its eyes were bright with the will to live. They had made it. Above them, the land rose sharply toward a cluster of rocks and scattered trees. From this vantage point, Jiro could see the full scope of the flood. The once familiar bush was gone, replaced by an endless lake. But this ridge, this narrow, defiant spine of land, stood above it all. Jiro nudged Chirp gently, and together they climbed the final rise. At the top, they found a small hollow beneath a rock shelf, dry and safe. Jiro slumped against the wall, his body trembling with fatigue. Chirp nestled close once again, this time not just for warmth, but for something else, trust. They stayed like that for hours, dozing as the wind whistled over the ridge. The sun finally broke free of the clouds, and golden light bathed the soaked world in warmth. As the day wore on, Chirp became more animated. He pecked at the dirt, tested his wings, and even fluttered a few feet before flopping down again. Jiro watched, amused. He wasn't sure how long they'd stay here, but the worst was over. Toward evening, Jiro's ears twitched. A new sound, a distant, mechanical hum. He stood and scanned the far distance. There, moving slowly through the floodplain, were rescue boats. Humans in bright vests. Searching. Saving. Jiro didn't move toward them. He simply watched. They were too far to reach him anyway, and he wasn't one for human company. But it was good to know they were there. Chirp hopped up beside him. The little bird flapped his wings again, stronger this time, and lifted a meter into the air before settling awkwardly on a nearby branch. He looked down at Jiro and chirped 3 quick notes. Jiro blinked. He tilted his head, ears swiveling forward. Chirp did it again, a chirp, then a short whistle, then another chirp. It was a call, a farewell? The little bird spread his wings and flew. Not far, just to another tree, but this time he landed with more grace. He turned back to look at Jiro, chirped once more, and vanished into the canopy. Jiro stood there for a long while, staring at the spot where Chirp had disappeared. The flood would recede eventually. The land would dry, life would return, but something had changed in him, something he couldn't name. He turned and looked toward the distant mountains, where more storms brewed in the horizon, not of rain, but of decisions. Because this wasn't the end. And deep in his heart, Jiro knew, this story wasn't over yet. The sun crept over the flooded plains like a cautious guest, golden light reflecting off waters that no longer raged but lingered, quiet and watchful. Insects resumed their songs. Distant kookaburras laughed from trees spared by the flood. And high on the ridge, Jiro stood motionless, gazing into the distance where the small bird he'd saved had disappeared. It had been 2 days since Chirp flew off. Jiro had stayed in the hollow beneath the rocky shelf, where dry earth still held warmth. His muscles had begun to recover, but the flood had taken more than strength, it had changed something deeper inside him. A loneliness he hadn't even known he carried had been filled, briefly, by the fragile heartbeat of another creature. And now it was gone again. He should have moved on. That was the way of the bush. Life changed, shifted, moved forward. Kangaroos didn't form bonds like this. But he couldn't quite leave the ridge. Not yet. On the 3rd morning, something strange stirred the air. A sound, barely more than a whisper, floated on the breeze. Jiro's ears twitched. It wasn't the hum of distant rescue boats or the drone of cicadas. It was sharper, quicker. Chirp. He turned, scanning the trees. For a moment, there was nothing but shifting leaves and the crackle of breeze through branches. Then, a flutter. A blur of yellow and brown. Chirp landed on the branch of a crooked ironbark tree, only a few meters away. But he wasn't alone. 2 more birds followed, larger, with golden throats like his own. One perched beside Chirp, the other behind. They chirped excitedly, their voices weaving together in high, staccato patterns like a song Jiro had never heard before. Chirp had returned, with family. The little bird puffed out his chest, then swooped down, landing just beside Jiro's massive paw. He hopped in place, chirping a melody that rose and fell with unmistakable emotion. Jiru lowered his head, his long ears drooping, and blinked slowly. Chirp pecked gently at the ground, then turned toward the distant trees, where the floodwaters had finally begun to retreat. Jiru followed his gaze. Was it an invitation? The bird looked back once more and flapped his wings. Jiru hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was being asked. He was no bird. He had no nest to return to. But something in the way Chirp lingered told him it wasn't a request to follow, it was a request to see. So Jiru rose, gave one last look at the hollow that had kept him safe, and began descending the ridge. The land below was unrecognizable. Where once there were dry gullies and winding animal trails, now lay thick mud, debris, and tangled grass. The water was retreating in slow spirals, leaving behind a new landscape. As he moved, Chirp and the others soared ahead, looping back to guide him. They danced between branches, calling out with shrill joy, as though celebrating every patch of dry ground found beneath the wreckage. Jiru paused at the base of a washed-out eucalyptus and watched the birds land on a fallen branch nearby. It was then he noticed something. Nest materials, twigs, grasses, strips of bark, gathered in a small mound beneath the roots of the tree. Chirp was rebuilding. Despite the flood, despite the loss of his first nest, the little bird had chosen to return. Not just to survive, but to begin again. The other birds joined him, weaving the pieces with their beaks, chirping to one another, placing every fragment with care. Jiru stood for a long time, watching them work. And something inside him shifted again. Not long after, movement on the far side of the clearing caught his eye. A wallaby, soaked and limping. Then an echidna emerged from the brush, followed by a cautious red fox slinking toward dry rocks. All around, life was returning. Jiru's thoughts drifted to others who might not have been so lucky. The creatures swept away by the flood, the nests lost, the burrows drowned. But nature was already at work reclaiming what had been taken. He felt no sadness now, only a solemn reverence. Chirp returned to his side briefly, pecked at the dirt, then lifted into the air and hovered for a second, wings outstretched, facing Jiru, before flying toward the nearly finished nest. A final thank you, perhaps. Jiru took a step back. His work here was done. He turned away from the clearing and made his way toward a stand of gum trees that had weathered the storm. There, new grass was beginning to push through the mud. Beyond it, he could find higher plains, old paths, and perhaps other survivors. His journey wasn't over. As he moved forward, the wind carried one last song from Chirp's family, bright, complex, joyful. The sound followed Jiru like a ribbon, trailing through the trees and lingering in the air like a story half-sung. The flood had come and gone. But the bond between a kangaroo and a tiny bird, formed in the heart of chaos, built on courage and kindness, would never vanish. And somewhere, in that vast and wild land, two hearts that should never have met had touched and changed one another forever.